I always thought that saying no to someone was enough for them to understand, but it turns out that's not always the case. It all started when my sister asked me to babysit her two kids so she could go out with her friends. I made it very clear that I couldn't. I had an important exam, but on the scheduled day, as soon as I opened the door, the two kids were standing there and my sister was already speeding away. No explanation, no choice. What was I supposed to do in that situation? Take care of the kids against my will and miss my exam, or find a way to stick to my plan? What I did next made my sister furious and the whole family turned against me. I still remember that day vividly, a morning when I was supposed to be completely focused on preparing for my crucial college entrance exam. But life is rarely as simple as we hope. A few days earlier, my older sister had asked me to watch her two kids, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, so she could go out with her friends. It wasn't the first time she had asked me for help, and honestly, I had looked after them a few times before, but this time was different. I had an exam, and I knew I couldn't divide my attention between studying and anything else. So, I made it very clear to her that I couldn't babysit that day. I wasn't vague or hesitant. I didn't say, "Let me see," or "maybe." I was straightforward and said no. This exam was extremely important to me, and while I could take some online classes, there was no way I could study properly while also taking care of two young kids, especially not on such a crucial day. I thought she would understand. After all, it wasn't my responsibility. But apparently, my sister didn't care about my answer. Or worse, she thought I didn't actually have the right to say no. The day arrived. I woke up feeling normal, ready to dedicate my entire day to final exam preparations. But when I heard a knock at the door that morning, I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side. When I opened the door, my two little nieces stood there, their big, innocent eyes looking up at me, completely unaware that they weren't supposed to be there. Before I could even react, my sister had already gotten into her car and sped off, leaving me standing there in shock. I couldn't believe it. I had been crystal clear with her. I couldn't babysit today. But she had still dropped the kids off at my door without any warning, without asking how I would manage, and without even sending a text beforehand. It was as if she believed that simply leaving them with me meant I would automatically take responsibility. I looked at the kids, then at the clock. If I accepted this situation, I would have to spend the entire day with them and completely abandon my study plans. But if I left them outside, no, that wasn't an option. I wasn't heartless. I was responsible, but my responsibility at that moment wasn't to be a last-minute babysitter. I couldn't believe my sister had put me in this position, but now I had no choice but to figure out a solution. I took a deep breath, stepped inside, and started thinking. I couldn't miss my exam prep, but I also couldn't leave the kids alone. What my sister did was unfair, but sitting there complaining wouldn't change anything. I needed a plan. And luckily, I had a friend who owned a small daycare. I was still in shock over what had just happened. I had made it very clear to my sister that I couldn't babysit today. Yet despite that, she still left her two kids right at my doorstep before driving away, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I looked down at the two children standing in front of me, their faces filled with confusion, not understanding what was going on. This wasn't their fault, but what my sister did was completely unacceptable. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I couldn't let my emotions take over because the most important thing right now was finding a solution. Checking the time, I realized I didn't have much left to prepare for my exam. There was no way I could study effectively while taking care of two kids, but leaving them unattended wasn't an option either. I needed to find a way to handle this situation without completely derailing my plans. After a few seconds of thinking, I suddenly remembered a friend of mine who ran a small daycare nearby. She had once told me that if I ever had an emergency, I could bring kids over, as long as there was space available. Without wasting another moment, I grabbed my phone and called her, hoping there would still be room this morning. When she picked up, I quickly explained the situation. She listened attentively and immediately agreed to help. A wave of relief washed over me. At least now, I had a reasonable solution. I told the kids we were going out for a little while and hurried to gather their things. I wrote a small note with the daycare's address and my friend's phone number, then sent a message to my sister informing her that I had taken the kids there. I made sure to provide all the necessary details in case she wanted to check in on them. After getting everything in order, I took the children to the daycare. My friend welcomed them warmly, reassuring them that it was just a fun place to play for a few hours. At first, they seemed hesitant, but they quickly became engrossed in the toys and other kids around them. I stayed for a few extra minutes to make sure they felt comfortable before rushing back to my studies. But one thing kept bothering me. My sister never replied to my message. I had sent all the information clearly, but she didn't respond at all. At first, I assumed she might be busy or hadn't checked her phone yet, but as the entire afternoon passed without a single word from her, I started to worry. By the evening, I realized I couldn't leave the kids there forever. The daycare had closing hours, and if my sister wasn't going to pick them up, then I had no choice but to do it myself. I tried calling her multiple times, but she didn't answer. With no other option, I headed back to pick up the kids, hoping she would contact me soon. When I brought them home and gave them dinner, I genuinely didn't know what to think anymore. I had done everything I could to handle this situation responsibly, yet my sister showed no concern for her own children, not even bothering to read my messages or call back. I had no idea what was going through her mind, but I knew this wasn't over, and I was right. When she finally showed up around 9 p.m., things quickly took a turn for the worse. I had hoped that after a long day, everything would end peacefully, but when the clock struck 9 p.m. and my sister showed up at my door, I quickly realized that the real storm was just beginning. I opened the door and saw her standing there, her face filled with anger. The two kids immediately ran toward their mother, hugging her happily as if nothing unusual had happened today. I let out a sigh of relief. At least the kids were safe, well-fed, and unharmed. But just as I was about to explain the situation, she spoke in a furious tone. "You left my kids with a stranger? What were you thinking?" she nearly shouted. I blinked, unable to believe what I was hearing. I had texted her everything this morning. I had sent her the address and the phone number of the daycare provider. I had called her, but she didn't answer. I had done everything I could to make sure the kids were well taken care of while also trying to protect my own responsibilities. And yet, here she was, accusing me of being irresponsible. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm. "Did you even read my messages? I told you clearly that I couldn't watch the kids today. I sent you all the details about the daycare. If you had a problem with it, you could have picked them up the moment I told you." But my words didn't make a difference. She shook her head in frustration. "I trusted you to take responsibility, to do the right thing. But instead of watching them yourself, you handed them over to someone else. Don't you see how irresponsible that is?" I let out a short laugh, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You're calling me irresponsible? What about you? What did you do this morning? You dropped your kids at my door without any warning, drove off without waiting for an answer. Did you ever stop to think about how irresponsible that was?" My sister fell silent for a moment, but then she fired back. "That's not the point. The point is that you left my children with a stranger. What if something had happened to them?" I sighed, exhausted. "If you really cared about that, you should have called me back as soon as you got my message. You should have arranged for childcare yourself instead of dumping the responsibility on me. I am not the one at fault here." But she didn't want to listen. She kept blaming me, saying I could have postponed my exam or somehow studied while watching the kids. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did she really think I should put my entire life on hold just to be an unpaid babysitter? I felt an overwhelming sense of disappointment. I had done everything I could to handle the situation responsibly, yet I was still the one being blamed. But the worst part was when my mother found out. She took my sister's side. "Your sister already has too much to worry about. You should help when you can," my mother said, without even considering the fact that I had been forced into this situation. I shook my head and said nothing more. I knew I couldn't change the way they thought, but deep inside, I felt a crushing sense of injustice. I had done everything I could, yet it was never enough. I couldn't help but wonder, would they ever truly understand that I had a life of my own? Or would I always just be the one expected to carry their burdens? I had hoped that when I explained everything, my sister would understand why I did what I did. But no. She remained angry, and what frustrated me the most was that my mother took her side as well. Your sister already has too much on her plate. You should help when you can. I couldn't believe my ears. What had I been doing all day? I had done my best to handle the situation my sister irresponsibly threw at me. I didn't abandon the two kids. I didn't push them away. I found a safe place for them while still trying to protect my own plans. And yet, instead of understanding, I was being accused. I looked at my mother, trying to suppress my anger. Do you think helping is an obligation? I made it clear that I couldn't babysit today. She knew that, yet she still left the kids at my door without even asking me. That's not asking for help. That's forcing me. But my mother just shook her head, as if I were a stubborn child who refused to understand. But you could have compromised a little. Couldn't you retake the exam if you missed it? That sentence felt like a knife to my heart. I had worked so hard to keep up with my studies, to achieve what I wanted. This exam wasn't something I could just brush off like a casual outing. Just because I could retake it didn't mean I should be forced to miss it. And if I failed, there wouldn't be a second chance. I turned to my sister, hoping she would at least acknowledge some responsibility in this. But no, she simply crossed her arms and said coldly, "You could have just studied while watching them. Haven't you done that before?" I let out a bitter laugh. Yes, I have, but not on a day as important as today. And more importantly, that was when I volunteered to help. Today, I said no, and you chose to ignore that. My sister scoffed and shook her head as if I were the selfish one. You never compromise. You only think about yourself. My eyes widened in disbelief. How many times had I helped her before? How many hours of my own time had I sacrificed to watch her kids without a single complaint? And yet, just because I said no once, I was suddenly the selfish one? I felt utterly disappointed, not just at my sister's anger, but at my mother's unfairness. They didn't see what I had done, they only focused on what they expected from me. I took a deep breath, deciding not to argue anymore. I was exhausted. I looked at my sister and my mother and said firmly, "If helping is an obligation from now on, then I'm out. I won't babysit anymore, not even for a single day." Both my sister and mother were stunned by my words. Maybe they never expected me to be this resolute. But I knew one thing. If I didn't set boundaries, they would continue to take my help for granted. I turned away and walked into my room, leaving behind the uncomfortable silence. I didn't care anymore. I had done the right thing, and that was all that mattered. I closed my bedroom door, but the anger inside me hadn't subsided. I couldn't believe that despite explaining everything, despite trying my best to handle the situation rationally, I was still the one at fault. In my sister's and my mother's eyes, I was just selfish, unwilling to compromise, unwilling to sacrifice for the family. But what about me? What about the times I helped out voluntarily? The times I put aside my personal work to babysit? Were those ever acknowledged? Or were they simply expected of me, as if I had no choice? I sat down on my bed, trying to calm myself. I knew I couldn't change their minds overnight. But there was one thing I could do. I wouldn't allow myself to be taken advantage of anymore. I had made myself clear, and this time, I would stand my ground. I would no longer babysit, not even once. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at home became tense. My sister remained distant, and my mother occasionally made passive-aggressive remarks about how I was being rigid and unhelpful. But I ignored them. I no longer felt the need to explain or argue. I was exhausted from always being the one to take responsibility whenever my sister needed help. She had a lot on her plate? So did I. She needed time to relax? Well, so did I. But the difference was that I had never forced anyone else to take on my responsibilities. Then, one day, my sister texted me again, asking if I could watch the kids over the weekend. I stared at the message for a moment, then calmly but firmly replied, "No, you'll need to find someone else." Not long after, my phone rang. I picked up, and her voice carried a hint of irritation. "Are you really going to make such a big deal out of this?" she asked. I answered calmly, "I'm not making a big deal out of anything. I just don't want to be pressured anymore. I've made myself clear. I'm not babysitting anymore." There was a long pause. I knew my sister wasn't used to being told no, but this time I wouldn't back down. Finally, she let out a sigh. Fine, I'll figure something else out. For the first time, I felt like I was truly heard. Maybe my sister wasn't happy about it. Maybe my mother still thought I was being too stubborn. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that I had set a boundary for myself, and I wouldn't let anyone cross it again. This whole situation taught me an important lesson. Helping is a choice, not an obligation. If someone refuses to respect your boundaries, it's not because they genuinely need you, it's because they've grown used to taking you for granted, and I will never let that happen to me again.